Talk Like an Egyptian, a podcast about ancient Egypt with Dr. Chris Naunton and Izzy Lawrence. In this episode, Chris and I talk about the historical accuracy of the 1999 blockbuster hit, The Mummy. Check out our Patreon for more. Hello everybody and welcome to Talk Like an Egyptian. I am Izzy Lawrence. I'm a broadcaster and an author and a massive fan of ancient Egypt and all things pyramid shaped. What isn't pyramid shaped is my lovely co-presenter, the magnificent Dr. Chris Naunton, who is an actual Egyptologist with books and everything.
Hello Izzy, what a pleasure to be here.
This is something we came up with because we get invited by the great institution, the British Museum, to do these little behind-the-screens recordings where we watch a film and then we discuss with the British Museum members. We don't discuss with them. They get to ask questions, but we get to show off and explain everything wrong with the film that we've just watched in terms of historical accuracy.
Pick it apart and ruin it for them retrospectively.
Basically, the film that we picked apart most recently was, of course, the great 1999 wonder of cinema, which is The Mummy.
Yes.
With Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. And see, I should really have got all the names of all the people who are in it. Omid's in it. Omid Jalili, who is one of my favourite comedians. Because a lot of the audience members said we should do this as a podcast. So we thought, why don't we do it? Why don't we? And where better to start than with what really is the movie that a lot of people base their understanding of ancient Egypt on, which must be a bit galling for you.
Well, I got to tell you, I've seen that film now more times than I care to remember, mostly because of these British Museum events, actually. You're quite right. It came out in 1999. That reminds me now, that's the year I graduated. It was the year I finished my undergraduate degree. So I would have been absolutely at peak, trying to be an expert, trying to be a know-all, absolute fuss and pedant. And I did go to the cinema to see it and harumphed my way all the way through it, I think, and came out of the end shaking my head. And actually, it's not that bad. What we didn't really do maybe enough, do you think, in the BM, but is to say all the things they got right, because it's kind of funnier, isn't it, and easier to just say, oh, well, that's wrong and that's stupid. Why'd they do that? And I guess that's maybe sort of partly was my job as the Egyptologist there. But actually, it does get quite a lot right, and in fact, they did have good people working on it, and so maybe now is the time for it to go back up in our estimation.
Well, should we talk about what it looked like? I'm going to put a picture in front of you just to remind you to help us.
There we go.
The actual ancient Egypt bits are set in, I think, 1290 BCE, which is a while ago. You've got Imhotep looking out over these great vistas with very organised military marches, looking a bit more what I imagine sort of 1930s Germany looked like rather than ancient Egypt. But if we'd gone to a city back in ancient Egypt, I mean, presumably Giza in this case, because those are I can see pyramids in the background. But is this a realistic depiction of what ancient Egypt cities were like?
No. No, and it's funny actually you say it must be Giza, right? Because of those massive pyramids in the background. And I agree. There are lots of pyramids in lots of different places in Egypt. The most famous ones are at Giza. The biggest ones are at Giza. And the ones that appear in the film, in this scene in particular, do look like the Giza pyramids. But then they're sort of in the background, aren't they? And then everything that's in front of them, these kinds of towers that we call pylons, we use a Greek word to describe these roughly sort of triangular trapezoid shaped towers with colossal statues in front of them and courtyards and colonnades of enormous thick monumental columns, people running about everywhere. All of that is temple architecture, and it's temple architecture that we'd recognize from a much later period and mostly from different places. So straight away, the pyramids make it look like Giza and everything else makes it look like somewhere else. So I guess that in itself is something that's a bit jarring. But otherwise, trying to be charitable, if there are any sort of iconic motifs in Egyptian architecture which actually are present for I'm generalizing a lot here, but most of ancient Egyptian history, then they're these triangular-ish sort of shapes, tall triangular-ish shapes. So pyramids being the most obvious one, and they're here. Okay, that's fine. And of course, those pyramids would still have been present in 1290 BC.
Well, they're still present now.
They're still present now, precisely. They even though they would have been built much earlier, over 1,000 years earlier. Maybe we come back to that issue of things being in the wrong time. But anyway, so pyramids are one of those iconic motifs. Another one would be obelisks. These very, very tall single pieces of stone, four-sided with a little pointy bit at the top reaching up to the sky. Those are present here too, so that's
like
good.
Cleopatra's Needle, if you've been to New York or London.
Cleopatra's Needle is a very good example of an Egyptian obelisk. Exactly. Actually, in that case, built a few reigns before the time the ancient bits of the mummy are set in, but moved to Alexandria, possibly by Cleopatra. That might be why it gets the name Cleopatra's Needle. Anyway, all those things are called Cleopatra's Needle anyway. And then these pylon towers, also roughly triangular. So in that sense, what the film's doing is borrowing these very Egyptian-looking things from different places and different times and throwing them all together in one. You're quite right, almost Nazi Germany sort of monumental, blocky, square, almost modernist-looking landscape. The other thing that springs to mind actually here is you say, would this have been what an Egyptian city looked like? Well, it's all temple and cemetery architecture. So actually, you would have had a big temple at the center of the big cities. But as the way that the movie plays out, we see the main characters, including the king, it's sort of inside these buildings, and whether or not that's okay. In a big stone building, that's probably not right. They would have lived in smaller mud brick buildings separated from temples for the most part.
I seem to remember reading something about because down further south, must have been Thebes, I think, not Karnak. Anyway, point is, further south, there is an old palace there, and they got very excited because, it's mud brick palaces for the, pharaohs and everything else, but they did have marble bathrooms, or they had a limestone bathroom with a shower. So literally, that's the only bit, which is this monumental thing, is actually because you need to wash, and it made more sense to have that there. I want to go right the way back and talk about pylons, right?
Yeah.
Are the fact that they are outside these temples, so they're sort of like gates and entranceways to temples, is the fact that they are that shape simply, physics, and that it's easier to build a big tall building if it's got a smaller top and a bigger base is less likely to fall over?
It could be partly that. I'm not sure that we know for sure what the inspiration was, actually. I feel like we should say as well, just embrace this idea of this word pylon. It's funny, isn't it? Because to you and I, and most people, at least in this country, in the UK, a pylon is a great big metal frame thing to do with electrical wires. And Egyptology in general, and I suspect this podcast is going to be a running theme in the podcast, Egyptology is stuffed full of these funny terms that are used for a very specific Egyptological sense. And when you're learning, first of all, I remember this as an undergraduate, all these terms are thrown at you by your lecturers without anybody ever saying anything like, not an electricity pylon. I don't mean that. I mean a temple pylon. No one ever says that. So or in my case anyway, you spend so much of your time in sort of lecture theatres going, what did he just say? Did he say pylon? Why does he keep calling it a pylon?
Maybe he just wants you to run along to a cipher and jump on someone. That's also what a pylon is.
Could be. Yeah, see, further confusion.
It's a thing that bothers me as well. It's almost all movies you get when you have a king or a queen. They tend to be in this palace, and it tends to be like, even, films with Elizabeth I in, and, they show these like marble floors, and it's like, that wasn't there to put reeds down. And, medieval things, they have these like stone walls behind everybody showing the old stone. It's like, one, it would have been newer back then. Yeah. And two, they like to decorate. Yeah. I mean, this is, people in the past like to the Egyptians really like to decorate, mainly their really dead graves, but maybe that's just because what gets preserved. We can discuss that later. But, the temples are for the gods, not for people.
Yeah, it's tricky. We don't really have much by way of palaces. It's one of the kind of truisms of Egyptian archaeology that you have lots of temples and tombs and not so much of very much else buildings-wise. The reason being that temples and tombs, by and large, were built of stone very deliberately because they were meant to be buildings that would endure for a long time, which they have. It's why they've survived. Most other buildings were built of mud brick, which in itself actually it does survive very well. But it doesn't survive as well. And these buildings, in any case, weren't designed to be for millions of years, to use the Egyptian phrase. They were intended to be kind of, you build a palace for one king, and then, the next king would build another palace, or your average person in the street would build their house, and maybe their children would live in it, and maybe their grandchildren. But after a while, it'd start falling apart, and so you extend it a bit here and there if you need to, but then you demolish a bit, or you demolish the whole thing and you start again. And those things also, where people lived in ancient Egypt, the places where people lived are, guess what, in exactly the same places people are living in modern times. And so modern houses have been built by and large over the top of, or in and around the same places as the houses of the ancient people. So they haven't survived. So as a result of that, we're somewhat more in the dark when it comes to what it would actually have been like for Seti I, say. So Seti I is the pharaoh of the Mummy film. We don't, unless there's something I'm forgetting, we don't have any palace of his at all. We assume most probably he had residences in the important spots, in Paramesses, perhaps in the Delta, the region where his family came from, in Memphis, which had been the capital for most of Egypt's history, in Thebes, which was the most important center of worship of the state god Ammon. And the palaces that we do have were usually associated with or often close to temple buildings. But as I say, not built of mud bricks. So actually what's in the film maybe isn't really so bad. I mean, you don't get a very clear sense of the geography, but it does seem as though you've got this sprawling, massive sort of hodgepodge of Egyptian architectural motifs. And then what must be sort of going on in the palace, we think, are we even told that? I'm not sure. It's sort of next door.
Well, I mean, it looks like a palace with massive doors, and it's not where, Seti would have lived. He wouldn't have lived in a place with giant doors and people sprayed in gold.
Well, he might have done. But probably not the people sprayed in gold thing. Yeah, no, you're right about that. Are we going to come on to that later?
I think we'll come on to that in a little bit.
Yeah, the sprayed in gold thing, yeah. Let's park that for now.
But it's nice that they actually used, they didn't use the sort of like Roman type of, there are actual buildings there which, and the courtyards and everything else, even though I think the pylons are misplaced and positioned and all the rest of it, because Egyptian temples are very linear. There's a very clear sort of straight line route that you take from the front door, if you like, to the sanctuary area where the statue of the god would be at the back, more usually. And the pylons are composed of these two towers with a gap in between, which allows you access through them. And they would be facing you as you enter the temple. So there'd be sort of one either side of the entrance. You go through the entrance, you go into a courtyard usually. That is the kind of thing that we see there. But then you wouldn't encounter pylons on any other alignment. You'd then probably have another pylon in front of you at the far side of the courtyard. You go through that, probably into another courtyard, perhaps maybe another pylon. But they're all facing the same way. And you're quite right. In the Mummy film, they're sort of they're all facing different directions and facing inwards into this enormous court. There's nothing like that in ancient Egypt. Yeah, but it looks cool.
It does look cool. I think part of this is sort of audience expectation, isn't it? And, like you were saying, it often in these historical things, you sort of think, well, they wouldn't have lived like that, or they would have put some decorations up, or it wouldn't have been all scruffy or lovely or whatever. Maybe the filmmakers have to take into account what the audience is sort of expecting to see. And if it's a surprise, it might be right, but you don't want them sort of spending the next 10 minutes of the film going, should it be like that? Rather than just watching the film. And I guess people watching a film like The Mummy you've already sort of hinted at this, already have some kind of sense of what they should see. It should look like pyramids and obelisks and those sort of trapezoid, triangular-y, what we call them? Oh yeah, pylons.
Yeah. I quite like as well that this is not only a visual mashup, there's also like word mashup. So Hamunaptra. So that sounds like an ancient Egyptian word. It does sound like it could be a city because there are certain familiar phrases in it that kind of ring true, but that isn't true at all. There was no city called Hamunaptra.
No, I suppose because the whole point is that in the Mummy story, this is a legendary city, and the sort of point is that even the Egyptologists in the story say, no, it's just a myth, it's a legend. So they couldn't they probably couldn't have used a real life actual place name, because it would be a place that everybody knows very well was a place that really existed. So they needed to invent something. And you're right, the word, part of that word is the name of the god Ammon, is it? They've probably got that from there.
And half Cleopatra, and then just for no reason.
Yes, you're probably right. Yeah, exactly. Cleopatra. Yeah, I mean,
it sounds kind of Arabic because they use a lot of sounds. So maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
I was thinking if they set this in a Mayan pyramid, there they were finding cities up into the 80s of lost Mayan cities. That would have been fine. We could have had like Kakamol or something like that as the lost city that you're going to find. However, this is ancient Egypt, and we've been doing this a while. Even by the 1920s, they're not missing a city, I don't think. And I'm just trying to think of Akhenaten's city. Had they found that by the 1920s?
They had. In fact, they didn't really have any knowledge of the story of Akhenaten at all, and except from discovering the city. So that was kind of the first sense they had that anything had happened.
We'll get to Akhenaten another time.
Oh, we will. There's no sort of myth that I can think of from Egypt of a sort of lost city like that.
It's very sort of Mesoamerica, the whole sort of feel of that.
Yeah, a bit more like that, isn't it? Lost city of Zed and that that sort of thing. Anyway, not bad. A good attempt. The Ra bit at the end could be sun god Ra, maybe.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, but it's not. Cleopatra isn't Ra, is it?
No, it's not.
Name,
no, it's not. No,
that's Greek, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, we've got so much to talk about. That's the thing about ancient Egypt. There's loads. There's absolutely
we're not
loads.
going to run out of things. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We should definitely talk about who is real in the film, because like Imhotep, real dude.
Yeah, I find this very interesting. So Imhotep is the main character in the 1930s Mummy film, where Boris Karloff very famously gets all dressed up and has amazing makeup and is the sort of the definitive Hollywood mummy. So that character is Imhotep, and I guess that's kind of established the name for the bad guy of movies of this kind. But Imhotep, you're right, was a real life person. And what's really interesting is there's lots of layers to this, because the Imhotep of ancient Egypt was a real person who subsequently became almost a legend. So in the late peririd,
so you're going to have to explain all of what
I will.
Late period means, all of this.
I will. So dynastic Egyptian history is broken down into 30 dynasties. Each of those dynasties is a line of kings, one after the other, more or less.
It lasts for ages.
It goes on for ages. Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
3,000 years nearly?
Yeah, for sake of convenience, if you think of the very first king of the very first dynasty as having come to the throne in 3000 BC, which makes it slightly over 5,000 years ago. And those 3,000 years lasting almost down to the time of Jesus Christ, if indeed any such person existed. For convenience sake, that's a kind of way of looking at it.
Well, Cleopatra's the last one, and she goes out with Julius Caesar.
She is, but she's not. So I was going to say she's not part of the 30 dynasties. The 30th comes to an end. The last native dynasty is the 30th. They were removed by Persians. The Persians were Alexander the Great's enemies. He defeated them, became pharaoh himself, died a little while later, but Egypt was then taken over by one of Alexander the Great's generals, a guy called Ptolemy, who was succeeded by a whole load of other people called Ptolemy, hence Ptolemaic period, Ptolemaic dynasty. And Cleopatra is the very last of those. You're quite right. She married Julius Caesar. She then married Mark Antony. And on the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony by a Roman, Octavian, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire. So you've got 30 dynasties, Ptolemaic period, and then the Roman period.
And Imhotep's right from like the other side, like 2,000 years before the Roman period.
The real life person Imhotep, who is attested by a statue base and a series of mostly fragmentary inscriptions from a place called Saqqara, which is another pyramid cemetery site.
Quite close to Giza.
Yes, exactly. Little way south of Giza. All those places, Giza, Saqqara, and a whole series of others, are cemeteries attached to the ancient capital city of Memphis, which is just next door. So Imhotep was alive at the same time as the first king of the third dynasty, who we usually call Djoser now. Djoser was the builder of the very first pyramid, the step pyramid at Saqqara. And we are led to believe that Imhotep was the architect, the designer, the person who came up with this idea of building a monumental tomb in stone and in that shape. That's part of his sort of later legend, but he definitely was a real person around. There's contemporary evidence from the time of the Third Dynasty, from the reign of Djoser. So there was definitely a guy around at that time in a prominent position. We don't know much about him with that name, but subsequently the legend grows over the centuries. So by the time of the 26th dynasty, and we're about 2,000 years later now, in the 600s BC, he'd not only become a sort of folk hero, folk legend, he was being worshipped as a god. And over the succeeding centuries, he became one of the more important gods in the Egyptian pantheon. So as I say, there is a real life person there. He has this kind of afterlife as a legend of sort of folk tales, almost like a sort of Robin Hood level, was he real or not kind of person, and then becomes a god. And then, of course, in modern times, he's got this kind of third life, if you like, as a Hollywood bad guy.
Pretty good.
So there is a grain of truth in it all, but of course, the way his life story plays out in the movies is not quite how we think it would have really gone.
Well, he certainly wasn't in love with Seti's wife, Anaxulemun, who I believe Seti is at least 1,000 years after Imhotep. So
yes, exactly. So didn't you say the film is that ancient parts are set in 1290? Does it say 1290? Yeah. That would be towards the end of Seti's reign, which is right, of course, because we see him being bumped off in the movie. So Seti is the second king of the 19th dynasty and ruling at approximately that time, 1290, 1300, a little bit before that, 1300. So that is a good almost millennium and a half after the time of Imhotep.
Was one of Seti's wives Anaxulemun? Is that a real...
So the name is a sort of arcane, kind of old-fashioned, we would say now, reading of the name Egyptologists would know better as Akhenamun, which is she was the wife of Tutankhamun.
There we go. Slash sister?
We can't know that for sure because we don't know enough about Tutankhamun's parentage and relationships, but possibly, yes. So I'm trying, as far as I'm aware, I can't think of another individual with that name. You know, I mean, it's an ordinary name like any other Christopher or, Izzy or whatever. So other people could have had it, including in the time of Seti I, who was reigning only a few reigns after King Tut. So the pedant in you sort of wants to say, oh no, that's wrong, isn't it? Because Akhenamun was Tutankhamun's wife, not Seti's wife. But actually, there could have been somebody called with that name at the time of Seti, I think, to be fair.
Because it's Amun as well, because obviously we'll do a whole thing about Akhenaten and his kids, but she probably would have been Aksun-Anaten rather than Aksun-Amun when... So
originally she did have an Artanist name, which was then changed to an Amun-worshipping name, which is all part of the story.
Seriously, guys, we've got to record so many episodes because the gossip
there's a whole
is amazing.
Series on the
OMG.
The restoration of Amun worship. Coming up.
Yeah, no, that will come up at some point. Moving on to other very attractive people. Actually, before we do that, I want to very quickly talk about Anaxulemun's dress. There's not much of it there. I'm just going to find it. Because I was researching the Cursed Tomb and I was reading a lot of these sort of old parables and old sort of like folk stories of the ancient Egyptians that other people have adapted and added to. But there is a story about a depressed pharaoh. One of his advisors tries to cheer him up by taking him out onto the lake, and they dress all of their women in these sort of very flimsy net sort of dresses and then make them row. And the point of the story is she drops a necklace overboard and the wizard has to sort of like fold the lake in half in order for her to rescue her necklace. But the net dress was in there. And I'm not sure if that's because the adaptation I read was the fact that somebody had seen this film. and then based it on this, just sort of that'd cheer me up, or if there's any actual history to it. And I wondered if you knew.
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, it's the idea that somebody would watch The Mummy and then use that as their inspiration for translating it. It's kind of hilarious. I think it sounds like the story you're referring to is what we know as the West Car Papyrus. I think there's a magician called Jedi in it, and his pharaoh is Khufu, I think, right? Yeah. It's a very long time since I've read that, but I'd forgotten the bead dresses bit. Strange. Such things have survived, actually, archaeologically. These kind of beaded fishnet, I suppose, sort of things, made of a network of strings and beads, threads with beads.
Not comfortable.
I've always assumed they were designed to be worn over the top of something, and they're found in funerary context, but not on the body or on the body. I'm not sure. We certainly have lots and lots and lots of representations of women in 2 and 3 dimensions in art from all periods of Egyptian history, and you don't see no one wandering around in bead fishnet dresses. Having said that, there are some very close-fitting, almost kind of transparent garments that you see women wearing in art, in Egyptian art. I guess it's all sort of context, isn't it? If you're with a group of elderly tourists in a desert tomb somewhere, and you see, among lots of other things, an image of a young lady in a tight see-through dress, somehow the mood is not conducive to thinking, wow, look at that raunchy image. I suppose what I'm saying is the Mummy film could have taken its inspiration more directly from something very verifiable like that, and she would still have looked Hollywood sexy, you know. The bead thing, I'm not so sure. Yeah, but you know, again, Hollywood expectations. I mean, if she's supposed to look like a sexy Egyptian, not necessarily like a genuine Egyptian.
Talking of attractiveness, and I think we can all attest to everybody in this film is absolutely beautiful.
Yes.
Medjay, let's talk about them.
Yeah,
because they are seen as these sort of like timeless guys who dressed all in black, with their amazing face paint, and I think they're tattoos they're meant to be, aren't they? But yeah. I mean, how real are the Medjay?
In terms of what they look like, the filmmakers seem to have taken their inspiration much more from later ideas. They look more like your sort of average desert dwelling Arab or Bedouin, something like that to me. The tattoos, actually, as I remember, the hieroglyphs that are tattooed onto them are actually quite good. There's quite a nice boat sign that the main guy has, I think. But as far as I'm aware, no evidence of that at all. That's just sort of for decoration. But Medjay were a real thing in ancient Egypt. There's some uncertainty about exactly what the term means. It seems to have had kind of ethnic connotations, and originally to refer to a group of people who came from the south of Egypt, quite possibly nomadic. There were lots of non-settled groups, particularly in the region between the first and second cataracts of the River Nile, which is the area immediately to the south of Egypt's territory. And the Medjay may originally have been one of those groups. Anyway, they came into the service of the king, and at the time of Seti I, by the time of Seti I, the king has a bodyguard of Medjay warriors. So, I mean, in the film, of course, they're, as you said, they're sort of roaming around in the desert, protecting whatever it is at Hamunaptra. And given that Hamunaptra itself is completely made up for the film, the idea of the Medjay having survived and having, inherited the role of protecting this thing that doesn't exist, it's all sort of fiction, isn't it? But it is at least rooted in truth, and the idea of the connection with Seti I is there too. So I'm sort of happy with that. Yeah,
and I think it's also important to note that they did tattoo. There were tattoos on people back in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, quite right to point that out. Yes, exactly. Yes, I mean, as far as I know, we don't. Again, I'd stand to be corrected here, but I'm not aware of any human remains, a mummy, in other words, of an individual Medjay having survived. So how could we possibly say that they didn't have hieroglyphs tattooed on their faces? We can't, because they did have tattoos. You're right.
So let's talk about, we've just mentioned mummies. Let's talk about the process of mummification in the film, which I think is exactly how it must have happened, surely. Because what you need to do is you need to get a load of people sprayed in gold and then actually mummify people while they're alive, because that's the point of mummification, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's times, like with the opening of the film where, as I say, okay, so the collision of pyramids and later temple architecture, isn't quite right and blah, blah, blah. But, all the elements are basically grounded in something good. There's other points in the film where it's like the script writers just stopped listening to the Egyptologists, or just sort of went, oh, to hell with it. Let's just have some fun here. Let's mummify them alive. Why not? So obviously they didn't do that. Mummification is what you do after somebody's died. You see this mummification workshop in the film, which is interesting in itself because we know that mummification was something that was being performed for almost that entire span of Egyptian history, from maybe not from the very earliest times, but it's a very elaborate process that's well established from early enough right the way down into Roman times. So for thousands of years, there would have been these workshops with professional, skilled embalmers who knew all the steps and what to do. And those steps basically involve removing certain internal organs and then mummifying those internal organs separately, purifying the body, washing it and drying it. And all of those steps in the process, actually, although they come to be attached to sort of very esoteric kind of rituals, are essentially all about removing impurities from the body so as to arrest the process of decay. They're actually very good at that, whether they think it's what the basis for it is to do with the gods or whatever. The science of that is actually very good. You remove all these impure things like the stomach, liver, lungs, intestines. Those things harbor high quantities of bad stuff that will start eating your body away if you don't remove them. So get rid of them. Great. Stops the decay process, as does removing water and obviously the washing process too. And yet, despite the fact that, this must have happened all the time, and we've got lots of mummies, and actually we even have parts of the kit that they used, and that's survived in some places, we don't have very clear evidence for the workshops themselves. So it's quite interesting to see that on the screen, because somebody's had a go at saying, well, look, they must have existed. Maybe they look like this. I mean, it's a bit sort of odd in that it's a bit, I don't know, looks a bit big. Lots of people.
Looks inside as well. I don't know why. I sort of imagine you'd want airflow, is what I'm thinking.
Yes. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, exactly. In fact, the last step in the process, we are told, part of the process is that the mummy is embalmed, is purified using particular things, palm wine. It's embalmed using oils. A part of the purpose of the oil is that it's fragrant. It smells very nice, because otherwise, a decaying corpse is pretty rancid. So yes, I'm sure you're right. Outdoors, probably better.
At least in some sort of tent where you can open the flaps and sort of get a breeze through. And presumably not right next to like your brewery and your bakery and keep it away. We assume these would have been in cemeteries. So, the sort of place where there ain't much going on other than burying the dead. The whole load of mourners, or, probably visiting their loved ones, and funeral ceremonies going on in the busier necropolis as well. But yeah, away from the business of everyday life for sure. There's lots of fire as well. I feel like there's a lot of fire pits in the sort of like big sweeping scenes as well.
Yeah, there were. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think they would obviously have had fire. They would have had flaming torches.
They're more likely to have oil lamps, though. We've got loads of oil lamps.
We do have lots of oil lamps, particularly from later periods. I just feel as though it's one of those things that's sort of there for Hollywood atmosphere as much as anything else. But then, again, if we're thinking more positively about the movie, they have the bodies placed on these beds. We see the wrapping process, the linen bandages going on, albeit while Imhotep is alive, but still, that seems to be done pretty well. It represents how it really was. We see canopic jars, don't we? Izzy, this is a particular.
I think we've seen 5 of them though.
Precisely. Yes. And they're quite. Don't they specifically say this? I think in the movie as well, they say, there are 5 canopic jars, and Why?
There are.
Why
there
would there be?
It's
absolutely there were 4. Yeah, there were always 4.
They're for the organs, aren't they?
Yeah. Sorry, folks. More jargon. So, canopic jars are the name that we Egyptologists give to the jars that the mummified internal organs are put in. I'm not going to explain where that name comes from, but it's kind of it comes from a misunderstanding, but the name has stuck. So we call them canopic jars, and typically they would have been freestanding jars made of ceramic or alabaster or something like that, if you could afford alabaster, Egyptian alabaster. The mummified and wrapped organs would have been placed inside the jars, and the jars topped off with stoppers that had sometimes human heads, but more, or the stoppers themselves took the form of human heads. More often, the 4 of them would be a human, a baboon, a jackal, and I've forgotten the other one. A falcon.
Yeah, falcon. I was going to say a birdie, but that's
birdie.
Falcon is probably better.
And this speaks to the idea that bit of the mummification process is related to the so-called 4 sons of Horus, each of whom is associated with one of those organs. And one of them has a human head. They all have human bodies. One of them has a human head. One of them a baboon. One of them a falcon. One of them a jackal. So yes, and that's what they look like. And in the mummy film, for some reason, there's 5. And I can't think. Do they have human heads? They have animal heads. That they invented another animal
head. So it's definitely a baboon one. I seem to remember the baboon one. It's imprinted in my mind. But it is bizarre.
We thought it was symmetry, didn't we? We thought maybe
we shot up in the museum. We shot up sort of like screen grabs of it, and it looked cool to have 5 there.
5, yeah, with 1 in the middle and 2 either side. Yeah.
But to be fair, they weren't going to use them anyway because they were wrapping people up alive. And once you cut out their liver and the rest of it and put them in jars, they're dead. So, you can't use a canopic jar and mummify somebody alive. And you can't really mummify somebody alive because I think there was an Egyptologist who did an experiment, experiments where they used human remains to actually make a mummy. And it's 70 days to dry them out.
Yes, that was a memorable moment in Egyptology. Stephen Buckley is a good friend of mine, a very nice guy, and an expert in mummification, and had done a lot of experimental archaeology, mummifying various animals to see how the process worked, and really wanted to be able to do it on a human body, and so advertised for somebody to donate their body to medical and Egyptological science. Yeah. And a taxi driver called Alan, who sadly was dying of cancer, volunteered. So Alan was mummified, and his body is now in the Royal College of Surgeons. And as far as I'm aware, Stephen and his colleagues go to inspect the body in the Royal College of Surgeons on a regular basis. The mummification would have taken place, I think it was probably about 15 years ago, and done in what Stephen believes is absolutely the peak, late 18th dynasty peak of mummification technique.
Do you know if he did the spells as well, and he actually did all of the correct prayers at the correct points?
Not that he...
Because all I'm thinking is Alan might wake up in the afterlife and be just like, whoa!
Yes, I know. Golly. Yeah, golly.
That could be a thing. And, suddenly Alan's just like, oh!
That would be a great movie.
Exactly.
They made a documentary which won a BAFTA, Mummifying Alan. Was the documentary.
I mean, of all the things to do with your body after you pass on, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So
amazing.
What I think we should do is, because we're coming up to what I reckon the programme length should be, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more, talk about one more thing, maybe just talk about like the actual 1920s look a bit, the Giza Port and Nile steamer. Yeah. And then we'll carry on recording the rest of it and maybe release that as a bit of a bonus extra.
Ooh.
So we could do the whole thing, but we'll just, do it like that. Is that cool with you?
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Do I get paid more for the extra bits?
Only in theory, because then people will want them. That's the idea.
Excellent. Yes, good.
So hopefully, and they'll give you
$1
or $2. So let's talk about the modern stuff then. Let's talk about like the 1920s representation of Egyptology. Because you've written a book called The Egyptologist Notebook, which basically charters the history of Egyptologists, which is lovely because the Egyptologists are obsessed with history and you're looking at the history of how they're finding it all out. It's layers of inception. I love it. So the museum and the curator How happy are you with how it looks and how it feels for 1926? Is this what it was like?
It's good, actually. I liked it. Yeah. Bless you for mentioning the book. Yes, I do have an interest in the history of Egyptology. I think it's incumbent on all of us Egyptologists to have an interest in it, actually, because you need to understand how our evidence has come to us and what the evidence is. And that involves sort of reaching back often through the literature to the point at which something was dug up out of the ground, which often is the point at which you realize, well, hang on, they didn't dig up there at all. We've been talking about the wrong place all this time. And inevitably, you get caught up in the history of it. And I used to work for an organization called the Egypt Exploration Society, which is a Victorian institution. All the sort of the big names of early Egyptology or late 19th century
So the name again, was that Bembridge Scholars? Is that what you...
Can I park that for a moment and then rant about it just in a minute?
Okay.
No, not Bembridge Scholars. The Egypt Exploration Society.
Okay.
Still going very strong. People like Flinders Petrie and Howard Carter worked for the EES. Anyway, so you get caught up in this sort of stuff, and the setting in the film, which is Cairo, I suppose, for a lot of it, which is where we find the museum. It's where we find Rachel Weisz's character for the first time. She's a sort of apprentice curator who's been set to work in the library, which I only realise now as I'm saying it actually was my first ever job. My first job at the EES was as the person in charge of the library. So I didn't quite do that.
So that's realistic in terms of where you start out. And there were female Egyptologists. I'm thinking of people like Margaret Murray and that sort of thing. There were women working in the field. Yeah,
Egyptology actually is full of fantastic characters in its sort of infancy, and a lot of the most important figures in late 19th century, early 20th century Egyptology were women. But I think in some ways, certainly not in all ways, but in some ways, Egyptology was slightly ahead of the curve in that sense. So the founder of the Egypt Exploration Society is Amelia Edwards, and she set Flinders Petrie to work. One of Flinders Petrie's earliest assistants was Margaret Murray. We now realise actually Flinders Petrie's wife, Hilda Petrie, was in fact doing at least as much of the actual digging and excavation supervising as he was a lot of the time. There are a lot of figures like this. Yeah, Margaret Murray, Margaret Benson and Janet Gourlay did some very, very early excavations at Karnak. There's a whole sort of subgenre of the history of Egyptology looking at pioneering female figures in archaeology. As I say, I like to think that for all its faults of the way Egyptology was done 100 or so years ago is not how we'd want it to be done now. It was maybe slightly ahead of the curve in the number of women in really prominent roles. So yeah, in that sense, Rachel Weisz's character as a kind of aspiring, budding, about to be very successful Egyptologist is in keeping with the real history of the subject. And the museum looks quite good, actually. You wouldn't mistake it for the actual Egyptian museum, but it's not far off. The museum that it's based on, which has just been overtaken by the new Grand Egyptian Museum, but the previous one was the third iteration of a central Cairo museum built at the beginning of the 20th century in a kind of grand European style, which is more or less what you see in the film. The library in that museum, even today, doesn't look that different from the library as it appears in the film. Loads of sort of wooden cabinets with, and sort of glass cases, and the card index is still there, or at least it was the last time I was there in the Egyptian Museum. It's really fabulous, actually. Sadly, I must say, neglected, but it's a really wonderful place. So all that looks kind of good, and the curator being a kind of balding man with a beard and a fez, that's not too bad. It's not too bad.
The 1920s costuming is fun. I think it's a bit extreme, but it is fun. Of course, none of the women have eyebrows. I don't know if that's because it's very 90s eyebrows going on.
Yeah.
But I think also in the 1920s, they plucked their eyebrows quite a lot, which is, I think that's all right, maybe. What about the other scenes, though? Because they go upriver, don't they?
They go upriver on a paddle steamer, which would have been the fastest way. You could have taken what's called a dahabiya, which is a kind of big sailing boat. That was how, if you were going to do a leisurely kind of Nile journey, that's how you would do it. But of course, in the film, they're in a race to get to Hamanaptra as quickly as possible. So a steamer would have been the way to do it. The museum authorities had a steamer of their own for going up and down the Nile. I mean, I'm not an expert in early 20th century Nile-going vessels, but it looked good to me. What I
quite like about the Nile is, because it obviously runs south to north is the direction of the water, which means it's very easy to get from somewhere like Thebes up to Memphis, apart from the bit where it wiggles, then we have to row a lot, but you can sort of like row with the current. And then fortunately, the general wind direction is from the north to the south, so it is possible to sail back up it, which is just cheating, really. It's kind of like the easiest navigable river ever, which is presumably why civilization was, it was easier to unite such a large country thousands of years ago.
Well, absolutely. And yet there is quite a lot of skill involved. And I can say this having done what they call the long cruise a few times now. The long cruise is all the way from Cairo, which is sort of at the northern extent of the Nile Valley. Beyond Cairo, the river splits into the Nile Delta. And then Aswan in the far south is the traditional kind of southern frontier of Egypt. In fact, when I've done it, there is still in use a steamer which used to belong to the Egyptian king, King Farouk, which would have been contemporary with the Mummy film. And that steamer takes, we stop and look at sites and things, but it takes 2 weeks to do that journey. But the navigation is actually quite tricky because the boats have to have quite shallow keels. Are we using the right
seems
word?
Like the right words, They're flat-bottomed.
Exactly. They have to be quite flat-bottomed because the Nile is quite shallow in places. But of course, the level of the Nile fluctuates quite a lot as well. It's regulated by locks and dams and things now. But even so, and then you've got to watch for bridges as well. So these boats all have collapsible rigging and masts and things. So if the river level is high enough and the bridge is low enough and you've got to collapse your stuff, everybody has to come off the top deck and duck down so that you can get under bridges. And I think all of that is actually quite complicated. There's lots of kind of island areas and meanders, and it's more hazardous than you might think.
Excellent. Well, I'll tell you what, if you're interested in learning more about bits of the mummy that we find fascinating, we're going to do a little bonus episode, which you can get by going to our Patreon at patreon.com/talklikeanegyptian. And there you can get access to bonus extras. We want to continue doing this podcast, so we welcome any support, and we will reward you with more nerdiness. I believe we were going to sign off our podcast with a traditional ancient Egyptian sign-off. Shall we do that? Shall we say it together?
Yeah, we should.
We should. So after 3.
Yeah.
Life. Oh, that wasn't me counting to 3.
You do a count.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Life.
Prosperity.
Health.
I will try and make that sort of like mash up in the thing. We did it completely out. We'll get better. That's the whole thing about podcasts. We'll get better.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Talk Like an Egyptian. To support the podcast and ensure another series, join us on patreon.com/Talk Like an Egyptian and unlock bonus content. Get in touch, talklikeanegyptianpod@gmail.com, or use the hashtag TLAE. We need your questions for the end of the series, so please don't hold back. Remember to leave us 5 stars of newts and share this episode with your friends. Find all links at talklikeanegyptian.com.